Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome, both in person here in Maynooth and to all of those people joining us online, wherever you are in the world. You're very welcome to the university and to the Centre for European and Eurasian Studies. My name is John O'Brennan. I'm the director of the Centre, and today's event on Ukraine is one, I'm sure many of you will know, of a series of events that we have run on the war, actually predating the 24th of February. We held our first event in January of 2022 in anticipation of a big event of some kind that we thought might be coming. Many of you will remember that President Zelensky gave a very memorable address to the Irish University community back in November. We had 300 odd people here in the university attending that event. A signal to me, I think, if it were needed, just how much the war in Ukraine has imprinted itself on people's consciousness here and elsewhere. And today I'm delighted to say that we're joined by a very special guest, Judy Dempsey from Carnegie Europe in Berlin. Now, Judy needs little introduction. She is, in fact, a native of Celbridge in the County Kildare, so she's almost a fellow parishioner. And she is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin. She made her name as a journalist, both here in Ireland, working for the Irish Times, and then subsequently for the Financial Times for much of the 1990s. I read almost everything that Judy wrote at that time when she was based in Brussels and as correspondent in Central and Eastern Europe. She then went on to work for the International Herald Tribune, and for some years now, she's been a senior non-resident fellow for Carnegie Europe in Berlin. I think it's fair to say that there are few people who have come out of Ireland who have the knowledge that Judy has of the world of foreign policy, security, defense, and geopolitics. So we thought it would be a good idea to examine at this juncture just how and in what ways the war in Ukraine has impacted on Europe. And there's no better person, I think, qualified to lead us in this discussion. So we're extremely grateful that Judy has traveled from Berlin to be with us and to give us the benefit of her wisdom. She's going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. After that, we'll open the session up to questions. Anybody who has a question in the room, obviously, you can save it up. Anybody online who has a question, you just have to use the Q&A function in chat, and I'll be able to relay those questions to Judy. So without further ado, a great pleasure to welcome you, Judy, to Maynooth. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you for inviting me to Maynooth, which was just a village when I was very, very young. I just remember the seminary, which was way in the background, and we just never went in there. It was, you know, it was God's area. Anyway, this is the first thing. And secondly, it's, and I really mean this, it's so important to see young people here from so many different countries. And I'm always struck by this immense atmosphere that people get to know each other from all parts of Europe, particularly north and south and east and west. I think it's very, very important, and it's something we shouldn't underestimate. And just one thing before I get into my lecture, it's very special for me because it's very emotional. When I was going for a long walk today, and I was back here briefly 18 months ago, a year ago, to see Ukrainian flags outside the windows. And Ireland has given refuge to over 60 or 70,000 people for such a small country. And it's very gratifying and it's very special. And I'm proud to be Irish on this element. So I'm going to start on this daunting topic that John and I agreed on the title. What is Russia's war in Ukraine doing to Europe? I'm not allowed to say I don't know, because I might as well walk out, but it's slightly shifting. But let me make a couple of points, the essence of the war. I think we have to get straight to the chase and say that this war is a brutal war. This war is extremely horrible and brutal in its execution by Putin's army. It depends on how you define the military, and the mercenaries. It's brutal the way they have kidnapped how many thousands of children and taken them over to Russia. It's brutal in how they have bombed the critical infrastructure, the energy, the whole element of providing warmth, of water, of gas, oil, electricity to people. I mean, this is not a war in the conventional sense. It's a brutal war in the civilian infrastructure of schools, of hospitals, of people, indiscriminate bombing. And this is happening in Europe. And let us not forget, and this is a very important point, which I want to bring up later, is the food security. Bombing, depriving, stopping grain exports to worldwide. We know what Ukraine is. I mean, it's really one of the great food baskets, not only of Europe, but of the Middle East as well. And it's extraordinary that Putin believes that he can do all these things and believe that he will get the world's support on this. Thankfully, the grain issue has been extended for another 120 days. But on these 4 issues of this war, the conduct of this war, the Ukrainians have been extraordinarily resilient, because these 4 aspects of the war are about undermining the morale of the Ukrainians and of breaking that morale and forcing them into the negotiating table. And they are not going to do this. And we've got to realize, we sitting here and across the globe, the Ukrainians are not going into any negotiations until they are ready on their terms. It is absolutely academic and questionable if they're going to get Crimea. That's not the issue. The issue is what the conduct of this war has done, what it has shown us Europeans and outside Europe, what the Ukrainians believe is their absolute right to defend their territorial integrity and their sovereignty. That is the issue, territorial integrity and sovereignty. And this is a universal issue that the United Nations endorses. And that is why we have to stick together on this. So that's by way of introduction to get the human element involved. So what's this doing to Europe? It's very, very complicated. The Europeans under the former Chancellor Merkel after 2014, and that's a very long story, you can ask me later, because she was lied to by Putin several times if he was going to invade Crimea. But despite all her flaws and everything, she kept the Europeans together and imposed a package of sanctions. This was incredibly difficult for some countries, particularly the Netherlands, despite M17 being bombed down, and France and Germany. But she stuck it together. There are lots of loopholes, but there was a practice involved. So when it finally came to this extraordinary invasion over a year ago, the sanctions were rolled out and intensified. And let's be honest, there's always loopholes in sanctions. We saw this during the Balkans War. You saw this during the Cuban crisis. You saw this in South Africa during apartheid. There'll always be loopholes, but that is no excuse to actually not keep them there and try to fill the loopholes in some ways. But we have held together despite some reservations by Hungary and other countries. This is the first thing. This is very good, actually. There is a downside. It robs us of the diplomatic element in some ways in dealing with Russia, but we can go into that later. The other aspect, which I find absolutely fascinating, is, and I know you're having problems in getting your LNG terminal off the ground, or in the ground, so to speak, in Shannon, but the energy security, or rather Europe's, in particular Germany's dependence on Russia for energy, 60% of its gas and energy needs. This was Putin's geostrategic instrument. This was his way of blackmailing Ukraine, of blackmailing Germany. As you know, Ukraine was a transit country for Russian gas, and so was Poland. And this was a way. This is very old, these contracts between Germany and Russia, but this was the way of making Germany the the ambiguous partner in the transatlantic relationship, the ambiguous, well, not ambiguous, but just in the EU, but there was the psychological element. Germany is just too close to Russia. But this was a strategic decision made in the early 1970s of Russia on the one hand, wanting to decouple or weaken Germany's commitment to the EU and NATO, and the other hand, the German political philosophy led by the Social Democrats. Well, if we do trade with Russia, this was called the Ostpolitik, the Eastern politic. If we deal with Russia, yes, I mean, this change through trade, this will bring Russia closer to Europe. Well, we know it didn't happen. And it's very, very important, this energy issue, because this relationship, this old relationship between Germany and Russia, it just isn't because of centuries of competition between Germany and Russia and conflict and wars and Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, Peter lucking the West. Catherine the Great was actually German, born in Eastern Germany and moved to Russia. And you can always blame the Second World War for everything. But this was going into the Cold War when actually the former Soviet Union used Germany to weaken the unity of the transatlantic relationship. And you've got to remember, and maybe you don't know this, that when the independent solidarity movement was set up in 1980-81, the Social Democrats and generally the left-wing parties in Paris and in Great Britain were absolutely against solidarity. Why? Because it upset the so-called stability of the Cold War. And the reason why Germany anchored itself onto Russia on these trade agreements, because it was supposed to provide stability. But, you know, stability is a double-edged sword, because if you believe in stability in a totalitarian system, or even today in authoritarian systems, it does breed its own kind of instability. We must never forget this. Stability is not, it's not a static element. And if you have authoritarian regimes that we're going to stamp on stability, you mark my words, they breed their own sense of instability. So to cut a very long story about short about the energy, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who's Social Democrat, he has this extraordinary green minister, Robert Habeck, who's responsible for energy and climate. And this is a no-nonsense man. The Greens are divided between the fundies, the fundamentalists, and the realists. And he's a terrific realist. And what did he do overnight? Well, Nord Stream 2 was stopped. Scholz, under pressure from the Americans and the Poles, stopped it finally. And Putin thought, great, I'm going to shove the Europeans into hardship and cold and everything. Do you know that there was 3 liquefied natural gas terminals on paper, waiting for permission for at least 10 years up in the north in Bremen? Permission was never given. Oh, we know why, because of the German energy lobbies, because Gazprom and the German energy lobbies were in cahoots with each other. Overnight, Habeck said, we're building them. They're built. They're commissioned. We're getting American energy. And I mean, this has been extraordinarily successful. Germany now does not import any more energy from Russia. None. It's zero. It's really very interesting. And the Dutch and the Norwegians are looking at ways to diversify. This is something that the European Union wanted for at least 15 years. Diversify, diversify, diversify. The Poles warned the Germans, and some other countries warned the Germans, and somehow the Social Democrats and even Merkel, no, this is a private transactional thing with Putin. Energy is geostrategic, whether it's Saudi Arabia or it is geostrategic, and you've got to be extremely careful. Get that LNG thing up and running. And the downside, well, the political element of the energy thing, and you get this a certain aspect in Germany is an anti-Americanism. Oh, the Americans now, they're exploiting the war in Ukraine by selling Germany gas and shale gas and LNG. Excuse me. And without the American gas, the central heating systems wouldn't be working and industry wouldn't be working. But the upside is that Germany and the European Union finally are diversifying. The reserves are more or less full, 70%, and we're ready for next year as well. And we're looking towards other countries to import gas. So actually, this is a really positive side. And the other good aspect is that it's going to speed up renewables. We can, yeah, and that this is already happening. And there's going to be a big debate on nuclear energy. You know, the Germans don't want this to happen, and this is a big bone of contention between France and Germany now over the future of nuclear energy. There's only so far you can be ideological in a war, frankly. And there has to be room for pragmatism and consensus. But we'll see how this sorts out this huge row between Germany and France, which is a different issue. The other aspect is on what the war has done to Europe. It's very interesting. The war, while it has united Europe on the sanctions and on an energy policy, historically and politically, it has actually divided Europe. And I find this very interesting. So I remember covering the enlargement negotiations, which were the best thing ever that happened to Europe when all the former communist countries joined in 2004. And the Poles do know how to celebrate when this happened. And they joined NATO as well. There was a NATO expansion in 1999 as well. But somehow the old Western Europe didn't adjust to the historical and cultural differences of the East Europeans. They come from a different culture. They were occupied. Their view is very, very special. Their literature is special. The historical experience are special. And I remember there was an element of patronizing these Central European countries. But they were Atlanticist. Of course, they were delighted to be in the EU and NATO, but they were instinctively Atlanticist. And when the Georgian War broke out in 2008, the Poles and the Baltic states warned the Europeans, you've got to be really tough with Putin. This is only the beginning. And of course, NATO refused to give Ukraine and Georgia the membership action plan, which would be a conduit to eventual membership of NATO. But the Poles and the Baltic states and the Czech Republic warning, we are warning you, this is only the beginning. And France and Germany said, no, they were against having closer relations between NATO and Georgia and Ukraine. And I remember talking to the Baltic governments and the leaders and the Poles and the Romanians and Bulgarians, and the West Europeans did not want to listen because their status quo was with Russia. They had developed this philosophical issue that let's not upset this basket because this is about stability. Well, stability was punctured in 2008 with Georgia. I mean, and the writing should have been on the wall, but we ignored it. And then we saw the Arab Spring, which really did huge damage to the Europeans and to the Americans. Let's not forget the anniversary of the Iraq War. And then came 2014. And in February 2014, Angela Merkel was sitting in her office, and she never liked Putin, but she had to get on with him, and she phoned him up. And she said, listen, what are your plans with Crimea? Oh, no, I'm not going to invade Crimea. No. And she said, is this the truth that you're not going to invade Crimea? No, I'm not going to. Well, he did. And that was the end of the relationship. And, but she didn't use the end of the relationship to be much tougher. She used a sanctions regime. She could have cut off Nord Stream 2. I think Europe lost a great moment then to really push for a proper, more integrated European foreign political policy. And we didn't. And the sanctions were okay, but it didn't do anything for the unity of Europe, despite being united on the sanctions. And then we had all the rumblings and the build-up on the Russia-Ukrainian border December, January, 12 months ago. And I must say, I was quite shocked by the level of intelligence. It was so bad, the German intelligence. French intelligence is very good, but it's more focused on Africa, actually. and probably India, but the level of intelligence was abysmal. And the Americans had warned the Germans and the French, this is what's happening. The British intelligence is a little bit better. No, it's not going to happen. Zelensky didn't help either. He was a bit bravado. No, they're not going to invade. Well, look at the satellite pictures. They're not there for a picnic, all these tanks and everything and the whole armor. In any case, so they invaded, and big time. It's quite shocking, it was frightening. And that invasion and bombing in Kiev and what happened in Bucha, it actually, this was the big change in Europe, and especially in Germany. Not only did Chancellor Scholz give his big Zeitenwende speech, the turning point, Germany takes time to change, so we have to be understanding of this. Increasing the defense budget and exporting weapons to allowing weapons to be exported to conflict zones. But it was the beginning of something terribly fundamental. This was a war happening in Europe. Ukraine is Europe. You sit in Berlin and the Polish border is, 70 or 80 clicks on the train. It's 1.5 hour, 2 hour flight trip to Kiev. This is happening in Europe. And I think what happened was that the comfort zone that we had lived in the 1990s, even after the Balkan Wars, we lived in this comfort zone. We didn't take the lessons of the Balkan Wars to heart, and we should have really pushed the foreign and security policy. The comfort zone was punctured. And this comfort zone is about, oh, it won't happen to us, or, well, it'll go away, or no, it'll end. We should have known with the millions of refugees fleeing Syria and Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, but especially after 2015, we should have known that comfort zone is not a luxury. We can't hold on to this. This was the end of the Cold War era. So I think Russia's invasion was everything that Putin didn't want it to be. It kept Europe together despite all the flaws and weaknesses. It's remarkable. It actually punctured the comfort zone in a way that I think, and I may be wrong on this, I think that there is now for once a common threat perception. What was interesting in Europe for such a long time after 1989 was that there wasn't a common threat perception. The North perceived Russia as the threat, the South perceived migration as the threat, and the instability in the Arab countries, and rightly so. But somehow, with everything that's happening now, I think there's a common threat perception taking place finally in among the European member states and inside the EU. And this common threat perception must ultimately lead to more integration on security and defense and foreign policy. And this brings me to my security and defense. The peace dividend that we all expected after 1991, we got lazy and we downsized, and every country downsized in many ways. But we should have known that this was only temporary, and we didn't understand what was happening after 2011 or after 2015 or after what happened to the Georgia War. But what is very interesting and depressing in some ways, but instructive about Russia's aggression in Ukraine is it just exposed the misery of European defense. We don't have the armaments, we don't have the coordination, we don't have the collaboration, we have duplication, we have 12 different tank systems, we have 8 or 9 different helicopter systems, one pilot from I can't mention Ireland because it's neutral, but I bet you do it in any case. One pilot from France cannot sit in. It's the British who patrol our skies. Indeed. A pilot, helicopter pilot from France cannot sit in a helicopter from Germany. By the way, there's no spare parts in Germany in any case for the helicopters, but that's another story. But actually, this war in Ukraine has showed the paucity of German defense, of European defense capabilities. And it's not a bad thing. Because finally, after all this talk about the European defense industry and agency and collaboration, finally, it may come together on this. And I think this is a good thing. And this gets me to my next point, that briefly touching on NATO and the transatlantic relationship, Europe would have been so vulnerable had we not had the transatlantic relationship and the spunkiness of Finland and Sweden to actually put away their decades of neutrality and say, we actually feel threatened. Europe cannot defend us. We cannot go it alone. We want to join NATO. And frankly, NATO has performed in my view, very well. We know why they cannot go into Ukraine, but this is a matter of discussion as well. But without this transatlantic relationship and without Joe Biden in the White House, we would have been in a very bad way. Putin would probably have defeated Ukraine by now, actually. I think this is very important to actually say this. But going back to the security issue and the defense issue, and this will be one of my second last points. I think it's something we should be very intellectually open about, that the European Union was based on a peace project. That's what it was built on the rubble of the Second World War, on the relationship between France and Germany. But it was also built on democracy and soft power. Soft power is the DNA of the European Union. And we poured soft power into the Middle East very badly. We poured soft power into several African countries very badly. There's pluses and minuses. There's a soft power of the Erasmus program. That's a really positive thing. And soft power with other issues. But when it comes to actual aggression, soft power is not enough to defend our democracy and our way of life. And this war in Ukraine is about a way of life. This war in Ukraine is about defending our values and our democracy. And to do this, soft power is no longer enough. This is the first thing. Secondly, this war in Ukraine is not a regional war. This is not a little territorial dispute between Russia and Ukraine. This war has global implications. It's got global implications for food security, for migration, for conflict, for aggression, and it's got huge global implications on which system is going to prevail. This is what is at issue. This is about the territorial integrity of countries, the sovereignty of countries, and the whole idea of standing up for values which are universal. Really, when you read President Xi's speech today, mocking the universality of values, well, why do the people in Myanmar and the people and young people in China had the nerve to demonstrate against the COVID restrictions? It is a universal value, and we must defend this. This is what this war is about for Europe, and this is what this war is about in the future for the global context of the competition, of this competition, and we cannot afford to lose. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Judy. That was very, very rich and expansive. Before I go to questions, I just want to bring you back to the point about the United States and about Putin's timing. Why do you think he didn't do it during the Trump presidency? He may have been unlucky that there was a change of power in Washington, and maybe he expected after Biden pulled troops out of Afghanistan that the American response just wouldn't materialize. But just on the timing, I mean, do you expect that if Trump had been in office, the Americans would have done little or nothing? And this is surely a very important point as we come into the 2024 election cycle, the prospect of Trump coming back, or DeSantis, who has described the conflict as a regional conflict in recent days, all of the alarm bells going off in Central and Eastern Europe about that. So perhaps you just address that issue.
I never thought about the issue why Putin didn't do it when Trump was in office, but maybe he felt he didn't have to, or maybe the timing wasn't quite right. I mean, he was seeing, there were other conflicts as well, maybe he was biding his time. Maybe he hadn't thought about it, and if you read the literature around it, he hadn't come to the idea. But he was, he and his entourage, particularly Putin, was particularly worried about the future direction of Ukraine, that its civil society and the resilience and the whole structure was becoming just far too uncomfortably democratic for him. This is the first point. Secondly, I think he expected Zelensky to hang himself, metaphorically, this actor, you know, comedian and everything. Yeah. And I think he was biding for the time. And then when Trump lost the election, and Biden came in, I think it depends. You just don't know this mindset in the Kremlin. But I think he wants to see the lay of the land with Germany, particularly, and Europe. And also he had to get the whole structure ready. Remember, if you read all these interviews with his entourage, one or two people were only told about this. Lavrov, his foreign minister, was kept out of it. Yeah. And so this was a Putin decision because his determination to stop Ukraine drifting away and becoming part of the West. Yeah. And so Biden changed the dynamics. And I think with Biden in the office, he decided, okay, I'm going to test this.
Yeah. You mentioned also the European Union, originally conceived in reaction to the carnage of two world wars, and that common sense that people have an attachment to it as a peace project. If you're saying, as I think you are, that the European Union now has to develop elements of hard power, that I think for some people might be a bridge too far. Whatever the nature of the realities, it changes the nature of what the European Union is and does potentially. How do you think the case might be made by leaders in the near future? Is there the prospect of a European army, for example, independent of NATO, in a context where a President DeSantis might take the United States out of NATO, whatever about Trump, that this is something that really has to be prepared for and will change what the European Union actually is?
I think the European Union has to change. One. Two, the Americans, leaving aside their commitment to Europe, are just so obsessed with the whole China problem and Taiwan and Southeast Asia. And we see the new military alliances being formed by the United States and Southeast Asia. I'm not so sure. NATO will, of course, stay in Europe, but since 3 or 4 administrations back, the US wants Europe to do more. Yeah. And actually, they're not against the strategic autonomy. This is not about breaking with NATO. This is about Europe thinking defense, thinking strategic, preparing for the day when they have to defend themselves. And Ukraine is about this, firstly. Secondly, the talk about a European army and strategic autonomy is it's very emotionally charged because of the suspicions in the Central European countries towards France. I mean, France would love a European army because it's Gaullist, it's tradition leading, it's the only nuclear power left in the EU. And the Central Europeans would be highly suspicious of this. They wouldn't trust France and the Atlantists in any way. But we have to move out of this. It doesn't mean breaking it with NATO, but we really have to now make this transition to hard power. I made a note here before I came. Josep Borrell, the president of the European Council, he announced yesterday 1 billion euros immediate delivery of artillery ammunition, 1 billion euros for joint procurement, and then the Commission will ramp up production. I mean, this is the transition, and there's no denying that this is that we can just ignore this. And I think it's very important to stop believing that soft power is the panacea. We cannot be a diplomatic and global player if we cannot back up soft power with some hard power. I think this, unfortunately. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Well, we're going to go to questions from the audience. So if anybody would like to ask a question, you're more than welcome to. I'd ask you to ask a question rather than give a sermon, to resist that temptation if that's what was in your mind. Oleg, you're first in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your interesting and insightful review of the situation. and especially on Germany, and you gave the whole rationale which was behind the kind of German attitude towards East-West relationships. But so rationale is understood and clear. You didn't mention corruption, kind of high-level corruption, like Schroederization has become kind of a common word, but it's kind of in everybody's mind. But I'm always interested, and you mentioned slightly the how bad intelligence was, but Putin always says West is weak, liberal democracy doesn't work. They as corrupt as us. They just criticize us. So and they were trying, and intention was obviously there to corrupt, or using intelligence services to corrupt officials and politicians and so on. Are there any investigations in Germany now? Is it coming to the light, like what was done and why? So it's not just rationale, which is kind of obvious, but espionage, and, you know, all that.
Yeah. I didn't want that question. Okay. Let me just dissect this. There's a terrific new book written. Are you?
I'm Ukrainian.
There's a terrific new book written by two journalists from the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, and it's on the Schroederization of foreign policy. This is devastating. And it started in the Ostpolitik of the 60s and 70s. But this phobia about Russia, which was corrupt, there's no doubt about it. It was absolutely corrupt. So there's calls now for an investigation and a parliamentary committee to look into the origins of this and how could they get away with it. They get away with it through money and influence, frankly. That's one of the issues. Plus, don't forget the huge role of the economic lobbies, with the Dutch and the Austrians and the Germans all working hand in hand, the economic lobbies with Russia. And I remember traveling with them to the gas fields in Russia to see this. It was an extraordinary element of camaraderie, if you know what I mean. This is the first thing. Secondly, I'm not sure, I think the German intelligence actually is very good. And I think also that it works very closely with the American intelligence. But you know what? It was ignored. And there was a lot of intelligence warnings done over by the internal and the foreign intelligence community over the last 2 years of the Russian influence and the China influence, the different disinformation and cybersecurity in the last 5 years. And they warned the Chancellor, they warned, and somehow, and the Americans knew this as well. And I remember talking to them, and they hit a brick wall some of the time. Oh, well, maybe, and it's a very tough job if you're doing intelligence, because you're there actually to stop attacks as well. But when somebody's shot dead in the center of Berlin, Chechen, or the cyber security attacks, and look at the chemical attacks in Britain, hello. And this is where you need much closer collaboration, intelligence cooperation across the board. But and the last point is, I have to defend, your question is very interesting, because actually at the end of the day, our systems do have the structures of accountability and democracy. And I think this is very important, that yes, Putin say we're weak and we're corrupt. We do have the accountability. And that's very, very important to keep that in mind.
Thanks very much, Ollie. So Alan and this man here, we'll probably take those two initially, and then I'll come back here. Yeah.
A question. Why do you think the United States and Europe have failed to get across the very simple message that nobody wants to invade Russia? Nobody intends to invade Russia. The last thing that NATO ever wants to do is get involved in a war with Russia. And equally, that nobody in the Western world has the slightest intention of invading China. Taiwan is a different issue.
Okay.
And we know what the status quo means. It's creative ambiguity. But China has made, and Putin have made hay of the fact that they're able to hint all the time that they're under threat from NATO.
You've answered the question. We can spell this out, speech after speech or meeting after meeting. And even if the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg goes down to Ankara and says to Erdogan, can you tell Putin that we're not going to invade? This is a propaganda tool and a misinformation tool used by Moscow to justify why they're in Ukraine. NATO has zero intentions at the moment of giving membership to Ukraine. A zero, it would be made mincemeat. Why should they invade Putin? And then there's the nuclear issue as well. But no matter what we do on this, and the United States have said it, and the Europeans have said it, it's a mindset, and it's a reason, and it's a justification, or it's the blame game on the part of Russia. China doesn't play this actually, but it's certainly Russia. And you take this away, well, denazification is over. You take NATO away, well, why is he there? And then you justify, well, why is Russia invading Ukraine? What's the bottom? Why? We know why.
Yes.
This might be slightly off topic, but I was wondering, what's your view about the relationship between the UK and the European Union in regards to the Ukrainian war? With how it's kind of improved, kind of defused, kind of tension over Brexit. And I was wondering, do you see a path where the UK be closer to the European Union through this mechanism of the war, or do you still feel with Brexit there's slightly more tension on the line again?
Well, first of all, the good news is the Good Friday, the Northern Ireland Protocol. We'll see what the unionists do when Westminster discuss this. So this is good news. Secondly is the chemistry between Sunak and von der Leyen. She's quite some diplomat, actually. She's quite interesting on this. And this chemistry is important because von der Leyen is so close to Zelensky now. And Sunak has actually continued the policy, the foreign policy towards Ukraine of his predecessors, which is really very interesting. So this is a kind of emotional element. I actually think personally that the EU and Britain will find some modus vivendi on certain things. We saw the Franco-British deal, Anglo deal, a few days ago on armaments, on military elements. That was never going to destroy. That's such an important issue, actually. Two nuclear powers, and they have their own interests. And France will join probably this Australian thing too. By the way, I think so. They have their own interests in the Indian Ocean, which is fascinating. But on Ukraine, the UK, very impressive what they did, actually. And I don't, cynics say to me, my British friends say to me, oh, Judy, Johnson did this for political reasons. I actually think he believed it. And I think successor believes it too, and there's an awful lot of Ukrainians in Britain, but I think it's this thing of the Second World War, Poland, and then moving away now towards Ukraine. I think the UK actually showed up some of the EU countries when it came to consistently and still consistently defending Ukraine.
Yes, now for other questions, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about a term used earlier. It might seem like a slow question, but the term denazifying, is there, again, this could be very obvious, but do you think there's a particular reason it's being used over and over and over again by the Russians?
I found it very difficult to understand why Putin was playing this card. Zelensky is Jewish, but leaving that aside, he was getting at something quite deeply intrinsic in his belief that Ukraine didn't go through the big denazification after the Second World War. In fact, he was using the wrong language because it was horrible what happened in the Second World War between Ukraine and Poland and the nationalists and it was a very nasty war between both of them. And I think actually that Putin should have done something completely different, the debanderization in some ways of Ukraine. But he was using it to say that he was tapping into the older generation of the Russians saying, these are Nazis here and they're going to get you, and that's why we have to get rid of them. And I think he did this, and also this was to put pressure on Germany as well. It was quite a very crude and I found it very crude and unsophisticated, but he was just getting it. He was tapping into the Russian side, the Russian soul. The Nazis are after us again. Yeah.
Further questions? Yes, John.
Just to follow up on that, just the opinion inside Russia, we're talking about Europe, we already mentioned much of what public opinion is, and if it's going to be a long-term war, and I mean, the aim and purpose of the sanctions, one, can you clarify what the aim are, what the impact is, and second, what the consequence on the Russian population has been, and how their understanding of the sanctions and consequently the war has been.
How much time do we have? Okay. I think these sanctions are more than symbolic. Because what they are doing is something terribly detrimental to the Russian path towards modernization. And this war in Ukraine is actually delaying Russia becoming a modern, undysfunctional political, social, and economic country. And that was one of the raison d'etre of the German relationship with Russia, that it would become, that it would go on the path of modernization. And the sanctions are delaying this. There's no doubt about this. And as a result, Putin is looking for allies in China. Second point, sanctions never completely work, but it's the tool we have at the moment. It's our soft power tool. We don't have a hard power tool. And it's one of our responses to this. We didn't have many other options. The third thing is Russian public opinion. There's one element of Russian public opinion. They've left Russia. They've gone to Armenia, they've gone to Georgia, they've gone to Turkey. They do not want to be part of this war machine. And this is devastating. It's for Putin, because he's losing them and he wanted to bring them into his awful machine. It's devastating because this is an immense brain drain, and it's not sure they will go home again. Yeah. And this will actually delay the modernization of Russia. Can you imagine what modernization means? It means building a rule of law, building a rules-based country, building an independent judiciary, building clear property rights, building a country with a perspective. He's robbing them of these extraordinary brains. These are the younger generation, and I'm not so sure they're going to go home. And the other point is, and we have to be very careful because it's so difficult to know. I will recommend to you, and it's in English, but English particularly, the Russian Analytical Digest, which is published from the Zurich Institute ISIS. They've done some phenomenal work. But one point about this war, we cannot know what it's doing to public opinion because of the state-controlled media. But what we do know is that the way Putin has recruited the people from the ethnic communities has left a really anti-element of Putinism in these areas outside, especially in parts of the Caucasus. And secondly, the way this war has been conducted, that the Wagner group taking the convicts, it's been a very demoralizing element, especially because the Russians themselves, the middle classes, have not been drafted in. And if push comes to shove, and he actually starts doing this, we may see, if there's any left, we may see a change in the atmosphere. But you can read the Levada polls and everything else, but you have to, I cannot make a judgment. One tiny little thing. To believe that all the Russians are pro-Putin and they're all nasty and so pro-war and everything. If you go down this path, you believe that societies are not possible to change. And what is happening on the on the local level is that women, particularly in the bigger cities outside Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and Ekaterinburg, and other issues, they're doing self-help organizations to help the Ukrainians who had to go to Russia because they didn't have the money to go to the West, helping the kids, giving them medical assistance, getting them visas for the Baltic states and so on. There's little things we don't know about, and they do make a little difference.
Thank you. First Francis, and then James and Ezekiel. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A very small question about what do you think about the impact on Belarus? Obviously, there was an election which Lukashenko almost certainly lost. Now, of course, he's allied with Putin. What is happening within Belarus? That's one question. The second one is about how, at the moment when she is in Moscow, what do you think of the longer term relationships between China and Russia, obviously turning the old Soviet Union period on its head, where obviously China is becoming more and more the senior partner.
Yeah.
How will that develop, and what will be its implications? And finally, what do you think about the balance of power within the European Union itself, where obviously you have countries like Poland and the Baltic states, which have been the strongest, and other European countries have been weaker? Is this going to strengthen the countries which have taken a strong line on Ukraine?
Okay.
And what's that going to do with the human rights argument on?
Yeah, I knew you were going to touch on this. No, it's logical what you were saying. Do you want to take?
Yes, Jady.
There's NATO involvement, and I was wondering about the legal the CSTO get involved, and like in possible supplying arms or something.
Okay, great question. Yeah, one more.
And who was next? Sorry. Ezekiel. Yes.
Just two questions. Just in regards to President Xi in Russia yesterday. Do you think it is some kind of tactic to kind of sort of have these sort of two strong men figures, you know, imposing over Europe? Or do you think Putin is thinking more long-term strategy? And how do you think the war in Ukraine is going to begin to affect the European elections we're having next year? Do you think it'll be? Do you think we'll see more sort of anti-war parties, or will these kind of, or more sort of, I suppose, more extremist parties be either pro-war, or perhaps anti-war, maybe
In Europe?
in Europe, yes, in the European elections, Parliament.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Oops. Okay. Do I get a pay rise? Okay, I get a coffee afterwards. Okay, briefly, Belarus.
Nobody in the university has had a pay rise for the last 15 years. So yeah.
Okay. So Belarus, the prison sentences and the oppression continues unabated. It's a very, very sad country, and in some ways, the EU is powerless, and the European the European foreign policy diplomat, they're a great person. He was more or less expelled from Belarus. And the diplomats have very little influence anymore. Firstly. Secondly, we mustn't underestimate the Belarusian courage that they don't want to fight, and they've tried to sabotage some trains going to Ukraine and other issues. And Lukashenko goes and grovels to Putin, and Putin gives him a lecture. And actually, there's some logistical elements that Belarus provides, but not half as much as Putin really needs. Can you imagine if Belarus was really on that side, what would happen to the western front of Ukraine? And thirdly, Lukashenko is finished if Putin loses this war. And if he wins the war, Lukashenko loses, because he'll be even more beholden to Russian dominance and poor Belarus and the opposition. So that's Russia and China. It's too complicated, and I don't know. And trying to second guess what Xi's opinions are. This is a highly sophisticated country, and highly complex and huge. And sometimes you think, if I was Putin, I wouldn't like to be under the thumb of Xi. And Xi doesn't actually want to lose the relations with the West as well. It's just too important. That's my reading of it, but it's too complicated for me to give you a categorical picture. It's moving, and we will see with the gas. These gas deals are important, but they're not the big global picture that will change the global element between between China and the United States. And your third point, the power. You know, I thought of this. Will the power balance in the EU change? I'm waiting for the day when Chancellor Scholz tells us how he thinks the future direction of the EU, frankly. I'm waiting for the speech. Merkel never gave it. I'm waiting for him to give it as well. And he didn't give it in the Zeitenwende. Macron gave many great speeches. Nobody replied to him. And now he's up to his eyes with the whole pension issue. So France is weakened internally. And Germany, Scholz doesn't intellectually, isn't ready to give that big speech on Europe, even though the Greens do want it. And that speech would mean actually what to do with Eastern Europe, which nobody asked me about, but that's issue. So, and on Poland and Hungary, do you know the EU justice ministers met yesterday? They signed up to the ICC, and who didn't sign it? The justice minister of Hungary. It's staggering what the Hungarians get away with. And the Poles are running a very nasty anti-German campaign and a nasty anti-EU campaign, and they have elections coming up. I mean, what a great shame. The Polish diaspora is so motivated, and the Polish opposition is still divided. We can only hope that there will be a turning. I can't see it happening, but I only hope so. Hats off to Germany that they didn't rise to this debate in Poland. It's quite shocking what they're doing with the judiciary. It really is. But we have to keep, if we're going to criticize other countries outside the EU for not upholding human rights, we've got to be consistent inside our own home. On NATO, great question, the CSTO, they're not going to help him. What do you call it, the Common Security Treaty Organization, they've been very, it was you, yeah? Oh, it was you. Oh, sorry, it was you. They're very reluctant to get involved in this. And Kyrgyzstan and the others, yes, they're sort of supporting Moscow. They don't want to get involved in this military element at all. And this is the security organization which is meant to mirror or be an alternative. It's meant to be a Commonwealth of Security for some of the former Soviet countries. They're not contributing anything to this, which is very, very interesting.
Yeah. And in some ways, even pushing back against
absolutely pushing back. And when Putin told one of them to close the borders to the Russians leaving because they didn't want to get involved in the draft, didn't hear the phone call. He didn't. Yeah, the line went broke. C and the anti. There's two elements here. As I said to you, who asked me about the Russian thing? There's so many essays and stuff written about this. You have to be based, I think, in Beijing to understand what Xi's intentions are. And what we do know is that this is a leader, besides being highly authoritarian, he does not want his country to remain a country that manufactures textiles. I mean, this is going to the super high end. And curiously, I don't know enough about this, but if America does put the stop on transferring technology to China, this could be the huge pressure on China to speed up even more its technological prowess and try to divide Europe. And Europe will provide this, but I don't think Europe will go down this path because Europe is suddenly waking up to the fact that they better actually technologically really develop now, because if you want to do renewables energy and electric cars, who has the rare earth is China, but so does Mongolia and Chile. So we have to diversify. On anti-war demonstrations.
And the elections,
oh, yes.
the European Parliament election.
You know, it's held up. So it's held up.
Sorry, it's just Moscow trying to interfere with our events. Regular occurrence, don't worry.
I better wait till this a bit. Yeah,
don't worry.
Yeah.
It will. All things will pass.
Yes.
eventually.
So it's very interesting. So you have these anti-war demonstrations in Germany with the far right and the far left. They're very small, actually. And even the Social Democrats, the left-wing pacifist wing of the Social Democrats is beginning to change as well, because they see that history is being rewritten because of the policy towards Russia. But I think I have to be very honest. There could be a war weariness. I mean, the pressure on local councils, there's 1.2 million Ukrainians in Germany, there's 60 or 70,000 here, there's a housing shortage here. It's pressure, and we cannot be naive. They may come, oh God, I wish this war would end. And everybody wants it to end, but so many still understand the brutality of this war, and they're still supporting Ukraine. It's holding for the moment. I'm not so sure to be an issue during the European Parliament in the EP elections. And the European Parliament is so pro-Ukraine, which is very interesting on this.
Those pressures are very real. A couple of weeks ago, I asked the Minister for Foreign Affairs about this, and he had been in the European Council, of course, for the last 2.5 years. And he said migration is the #1 issue for almost every member state. And he was hearing it even before the Ukraine war, but certainly subsequent to that, again and again and again.
I think this is such an important issue because we had the chance to have a migration policy. This has been on the cards since the Amsterdam Treaty, frankly. But we had a chance after 2015, and Merkel couldn't push it through. And I mean, it's just so important to have a proper refugee policy legally and morally, and have a proper migration policy morally as well. But, some member states carrying the brunt and others not. But I must say, what the Spaniards have done, what the Irish have done, the Greeks have their own problem. Well, you've just come back from Bulgaria, and how they treat those fleeing Afghanistan, still in Iraq. But this demands a major rethink on how we're going to have a serious solidarity and share this issue. It's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Judy, if I could ask you one more question, which is in my sort of bailiwick, which is about enlargement policy. One of the maybe surprising impacts of this war is that Ukraine's application for membership was tabled, and Ukraine is now a candidate for membership of the European Union. I wonder, do you see this, putting aside the question of NATO, is EU membership a realistic possibility for Ukraine within the next decade?
No, not within the next decade. I'm definitely look how long Bulgaria, Romania took to join. No, but first of all, it's a huge country and there's so much to do, and there's a war going on. Secondly, when the war ends, the day of reckoning happens. And recriminations, and the role of the oligarchs, and how civil society can cope with the corruption. But the third thing is that is this word enlargement, is this the fix? Is this the thing that will fix Europe?
Yeah.
Is enlargement the panacea? Do we need something else? Our eastern neighborhood didn't work, and other things didn't work.
So we now have President Macron's European political community.
Yeah,
but there are many people, especially in the Balkans, who feel that this is designed as a substitute for membership and not as a kind of segment.
I think, looking back at our history of the European Union, it remains an incredible beacon for non-EU members. And secondly, it has been an incredible success for Greece and Portugal and Spain and Ireland. But Spain and Portugal came out of fascist countries, and the Greeks out of the junta. It's been extraordinarily successful. And there's always ups and downs. I mean, transformations are unbelievably complicated and messy and difficult. But so what? This is about building democracy. And I think, despite my hesitancy about enlargement. This is the tool we have and we can make it work. Leaders have to explain it.
And we should remember that back in 2013-14, in the Euromaidan protest, the European Union flag was almost as ubiquitous as the Ukrainian flag, reflecting this desire of people there to become a normal country, which is the phrase that I've heard over and over again over a long period of time in Eastern Europe.
But only 3 weeks ago, when the Georgian parliament, when the Georgian leadership,
Yes.
this pro-Russian Georgian leadership tried to stop the given anti-NGO law, we had this extraordinary EU flag.
Huge
And
numbers of people.
the lure, we should be so proud that the European Union is still this great attraction. And I never want to lose sight of this. And I remember in school, I was in school in Dublin, we had fierce fights between the nationalist element of the school that were anti-EU, take away our culture. Like, everybody speaks Irish now except me. And I said, no, we have to get out of this small provincial and post-colonial country and join Europe. And we did. It's the best thing that ever happened to us.
And on that, I have to mention that this is a very neat segue, Judy. Thank you very much. On the 11th and 12th of May, we're holding a really large conference which looks back at those 50 years of Irish membership of the European Union, and we'll be reflecting on how EU membership has changed Ireland in a myriad of ways. Alan Dukes and Francis Jacobs and others, I'm very glad to say, will be speaking at the event. So we'll inform everybody about that in the weeks to come. Should say also that our next event takes place on the 20th of April, and there we will have Dr. Dimitar Betche from Oxford University, and who also works with some of Judy and her colleagues. Dimitar is going to talk about Turkey and about the upcoming presidential election in Turkey and whether or not Mr. Erdogan will be returned to power, which has become all the more fascinating after the devastating earthquake in Turkey and Syria recently. If I can wrap up the proceedings, I want to say some thank yous. Firstly, to the Maynooth University Social Science Institute, to our colleague Anne Hamilton-Black, Orla and Rona and others. Thank you as always for supporting us technically for this event and so many others. We really appreciate it. I want to also thank everybody who has joined us online this afternoon. I'm sure you've learned a significant amount and had really food for thought in all kinds of different ways. And finally, I want to thank everybody here who's come out in such numbers on a rather typically warm, nice Irish midwinter afternoon. We're very grateful indeed. Please do stay in touch with us, and we will see you all again at our next event on the 20th of April. Thank you very much. I should, of course, offer my final thanks to our speaker, Judy Dempsey, who has come all the way from Berlin, flying trip, but I'm sure you will agree that it was incredibly illuminating, and perhaps we could just show Judy our immense appreciation.
Thank you, John. Thank you.